Hi everyone. In this video, I want to talk about making better prints in the darkroom. So A, I'm counting on the fact that you have already watched my video on enlarging your very first darkroom print. And B, I'm kind of hoping that you've gone through that process before on your own. I think you'll get a little bit more out of this video if you've already enlarged a print before and are just working to refine your process. So I want to start by actually looking at this test strip here. So most of you at this point have already made a test strip. An early question is, how do you actually determine what your correct exposure should be? How do you determine what your correct exposure time is? How do you figure out if you need to maybe open up the aperture on your enlarger or stop it down to allow more or less light in through that process? So my rule of thumb is that you want to be able to see detail in both the shadow zones and the highlight zones of your print. I think on this test strip, we're getting that in about these middle exposures, and whichever time you picked would be somewhat based on personal preference. You would know you needed to change the aperture on your enlarger if everything on your test strip was way too light or way too dark. That would be more of an overhaul or drastic change, whereas here it's just about picking which exposure time we like best because we have some that do show detail in the shadows and the highlights. So every negative is different, right? And each negative will have its own range of values. So I want to show you more examples. This is an image of a church in Iceland. It was taken after the sunset. So it's a little bit more contrasty as an image, but you can see the church itself was white, but there is some texture still visible there. There are lit up crosses, and those are kind of blown out whites, but that's okay. We were never going to get any texture there. And there is some detail in the mountain range. We can see the texture visible there, but we still have a rich black, which we do want with darkroom prints. I think it helps kind of ground a darkroom print to have a true black visible somewhere. So now if I give you the compare contrast with this, which is an exposure that needs more time, it's pretty clear. We don't have anything close to, our rich black values coming out. If we increase the contrast, we would just push our white values up where we don't want them to be. So we know this needs more exposure time. Similarly, here we can see that it's almost like there's a haze coming over our white values because this has too much exposure, so we would need to back off and have less exposure time. A lot of the time, especially when you're printing landscapes, your goal is sort of to be able to show as many values as possible in your print. So now we should talk about changing contrast. In the darkroom, we change contrast by changing which contrast filter we put into the enlarger head. As a reminder, these are the contrast filters. They should be hanging out near your timer. A lower number results in lower contrast, and a higher number, like 5, results in a high contrast. You always start at a contrast of 2, which is kind of your default. So if you go up from 2, so to like 2.5 or 3, you should see an increase in contrast. And if you go down, you should see a decrease in contrast. So how do you know that you should try to change your contrast? Here is an example of a print where the contrast is too high. Why am I saying it's too high? If you look at their faces especially the girl on the left, you should see that the highlights on her face are kind of blown out. They lack detail, which we really don't want to see in skin if at all possible. Also, the details on her shirt are totally obliterated because they're just pure black. Same deal with this cabinet space. We really have so many shadow values that lack any detail. So both our highlights and our shadows are on the extreme ends of the spectrum, and we want them to be a little bit closer together. So after looking at that, this is immediately kind of better, I think. It's a breath of fresh air because we can see actual texture detail on that shirt. We can see the skin a little bit more clearly. It looks like that's a better value. But this is actually too low contrast because you can see we sort of lost anything close to a pure white, and we've lost anything close to a pure black. So this is a little bit too far on the other end of the spectrum. So when we meet in the middle and find our correct contrast, this is what we should be looking at. And if you go back, it's kind of a subtle change from too low contrast to the absolute right contrast, but you should see there's just a little bit more definition. We do have a pure black again. We have a nice bright off-white. So this is how you can start to think about contrast. I should also mention that you shouldn't really start fiddling around with contrast until your exposure is at least in the ballpark. Contrast definitely will change exposure somewhat. Your 4.5, and 5 contrast filters will actually block more light. So if you move up in contrast, you might need to add a little bit onto your exposure time to compensate for that extra filtration. But before you even worry about contrast, again, make sure your exposures are at least in good shape. There's also another small issue with this image that I think is worth pointing out. If you look right in the middle, you might notice something on this image and every version of this image that I've shown you, which is that there's hair or dust on the negative. There's just this little curl. So to clean off hair and dust on the negative, you'll want to take the negative out of the negative carrier and clean it with an anti-static cloth. If it's one tiny little speck like this, if it's not a ton of hair, we actually do have air hoses in the darkroom, and you could just try to blow a little air on your negative while it's in the negative carrier and see if that takes care of it. On a sort of similar note about having kind of a clean look to your prints, I would make sure your borders are even, or at least even on the sides and on the top and bottom. So your borders will not be even if you haven't set the blades properly on your easel. So again, the numbers should match on either side and the top and bottom. You can see here I have nice, clean, straight borders. The print isn't at an angle. Everything looks good border-wise. Also, my borders aren't fuzzy. If your borders are fuzzy, that means your blades actually need to come in more, and your image isn't fully filling the frame created by the easel. So no fuzzy borders, no wonky borders, and even borders are another aspect of fine printmaking. So this image is actually a good intro to our final idea. This is the print that I made for that enlarging your first print demo. And I think even after looking at contrast a bit more critically, hopefully you can see we could tweak this image. So maybe we could pull a little bit more detail out of the dark fur of the dog. Maybe we could add a little bit more exposure time or detail onto some of those highlight areas of the background. Those are opposing ideas. I'm talking about taking away maybe time from the dog exposure and adding time to the background. So how the heck would I do that? How would I change exposure or contrast only on a specific area of the print? The answer to that is dodging and burning. So dodging and burning are terms that we use in darkroom photography that refer to a technique during printing where you manipulate exposure of selected areas or just an area on a print that deviate from the rest of the print's exposure time. So let's start by unpacking burning first. So when you're burning a print in, the print is first given a totally normal exposure time, and you add extra exposure onto a certain area of the print. You burn in an area when you'd like that area to be a little bit darker. So this would maybe apply to that background part of my print that I mentioned. So here's more or less what that will look like. You can see there's, in this case, a black piece of cardboard I think is being simulated here. And a hole has been cut in to allow a perfect little burning hole where you can just darken, again, this targeted little area of a print. So when you're burning in, again, you're using a card or other opaque object to block most of the print from getting any more exposure time. And just this little area that you're allowing to be illuminated will get darker, not the whole print. So these are light tight bags. You could totally grab one of these from the lab, cut a circular hole in it, and that would provide a perfect little burning tool for you to use. So again, burning in is when you want specific areas darker. Dodging is obviously the opposite. During your, initial or normal exposure, you're going to block light from falling on certain parts of the print, thus making them lighter. So here's an example of what dodging could look like. Let's say your overall exposure time is 10 seconds for the print, but you just wanted this figure's head to be a little lighter. you could maybe do something like a 2 or 3 second dodge to just block that one area, in this case the figure's head, from getting light for about 2 or 3 seconds, thus lightening up only that little chunk. So here's what some dodging tools could look like. Basically, it's normally just a, makeshift tool, sometimes out of hanger pieces with little pieces of black cardboard sort of taped on, to just create an easy way of blocking only a small part of the image from getting light. Another thing I want to talk about is in this illustration, you can actually see they've applied some motion blur to the dodging tool. That is intentional because with both dodging and burning tools, it's important that you lightly move them either side to side or even a little bit up and down. So either your dodge or your burn ends up blending in well with the rest of the exposure, so there's not this really hard edge. So remember to lightly move either dodging or burning tools. So again, just to wrap up, burning in adds light and makes that part of the image darker. Dodging subtracts light and makes that one part of the image a little lighter. So this is these two techniques rather have been used throughout darkroom photography's history. If you look at some of the most famous prints made in the darkroom, I found a lot of these Magnum photo prints that had been marked up like crazy to show these really elaborate dodging and burning notes that would be passed on to printers. So when you're making, especially prints that are this specific and where you've, really put a lot of effort into dodging and burning specific areas and figured out not just your overall exposure time, but your specific time that you want to burn in an area or dodge an area, make sure to record these, elaborate instructions in your printing notes. There's a section there for any dodging and burning notes you might have. So that's my general advice on making better prints in the darkroom. My very first really great darkroom teacher told me it took him 12 hours on average to make a really amazing darkroom print. I would not assume most of you will spend that much time on individual pieces, but just keep in mind, 1, this process takes a while, and 2, you won't master it overnight, so give yourself some wiggle room here. Thanks for making it to the end, everybody. Good luck.